Hello. So this video is about biological evolution. And while I will be talking about some of the specific nuts and bolts that you might get in a biology class, I'm going to focus on kind of the high level sort of theory of what's going on, as opposed to exactly how it plays out in individual organisms. So, when first thinking about evolutionary theory, which was developed, we give most of the credit to Charles Darwin, but of course he didn't work alone. But mid 1800s was when he published On the Origin of Species. The theory wasn't fully accepted in the scientific community until early in the 20th century, maybe around 1930 or so. It slowly started to become more acceptable to scientists. But before a naturalistic theory of evolution was provided, biology really consisted mostly of just collecting organisms. So a naturalist, as they called them, would go out and collect all the birds or all the flowers, all the insects, and then try to come up with some rough and ready way of categorizing them. Which ones are more similar, which ones are more different, and so on. And they come up with some categorizing system. But they didn't have an explanation for why the organisms were the way they were. And in fact, these three facts that were very apparent at the time just cry out for an explanation. First of all, why are there so many different species of organisms? First of all, why are there so many different species that do basically the same thing? Right? So they seem kind of redundant. Why are there so many herbivores eating grass? Why isn't it good enough just to have one or maybe two different species that are eating grass? And while we're on grass, why are there so many different kinds of grass? Why don't we just have one kind of grass? If somehow a divine creator decided that the world needed something like grass, fine. But why so many different kinds of grass? So we have that. And then we have tens of millions of different species on the planet. So just why are there so many different kinds of organisms? That needs an explanation. And it's not sort of obvious just by thinking that we've got a divine creator that made it all happen. Or at least that leaves it very mysterious as to what the divine creator's plan was. The other thing, and really kind of the main thing that needs to be explained, is why organisms seem to be so well adapted, so well matched to their environment. An organism just happens by seemingly pure coincidence to have the set of characteristics that are necessary for being able to survive in the environment in which they exist. So that organisms, animals that live in the Arctic, for example, just happen to have really extensive insulation to keep them warm in the cold environments. Organisms that live in a dry desert just so happen to have the characteristics necessary for surviving droughts. Those are the sorts of things that, like, without a theory to explain why organisms have the characteristics they have, this seems to just be complete coincidence. Or, of course, the plan of a divine creator who just made it all happen. The third thing is the fossil record. It has specific patterns in it that if we go down to the oldest layers of rock, in some cases over 1 billion years old, we go to those oldest layers of rocks that still have fossils in them, we're going to find organisms that are very simple. Typically at first, microorganisms, and then, somewhat more complex organisms as we go up through the rock layers. And we only start to see multicellular organisms showing up much later. And then vertebrates and other large-scale multicellular organisms showing up much, much later. So we have this overall pattern that the simplest organisms seem to be at the bottom, the more complex ones seem to be higher up. Plus, there's this interesting fact that there are a wide variety of species that seem to be represented in the fossil record that we just don't see today. Why is that? Why were there organisms before that aren't around now? That's something that needs to be explained. And when we're talking about certainly before Darwinian theory was published, But, especially if we go back even 100 years or more before Darwin, so we're talking into the 1700s, there still was no good naturalistic explanation for why these things about organisms are the way they are. So the only thing that's left over when you're completely lacking a naturalistic explanation, kind of the default explanation is one that I've already stated, that there must have been a divine creator that just made it happen that way for whatever reason, for the reasons that the divine creator has. And they may be ultimately completely mysterious to us, but the creator just did it this way, and that's the explanation. Then, of course, we get to Darwin. And as I said, in the mid 1800s was when he published On the Origin of Species. I couldn't decide whether to include the famous picture of the young Darwin or the famous picture of the old Darwin, so I included both of them. Darwin had sort of two parts, overall parts to the theory that he was promoting. And really, we could have one of these parts be true and the other one not true. So, for example, we've got the explanation for why organisms are the way they are, which, as we'll see, I'll go into much more detail on number one here, that we have these three things going on in a population of organisms: random variation, something like random variation, then natural selection and heredity, and that leads to long-term adaptive evolution in a lineage of organisms. Darwin also proposed that all organisms, all species on the planet are ultimately related, that they can all be traced back to a common ancestral population. That didn't have to be true. There could have been multiple origins of life on the planet and multiple different lineages of organisms that are evolving independently. And so, number one, the random variation plus natural selection plus heredity leading to adaptive evolution could be true, but it could be true for multiple different lineages, independent lineages of organisms. So, but this is the way Darwin presented it. He thought he had pretty good evidence that all organisms are ultimately related, quite closely related, as it turns out. But it's interesting to note that it didn't have to be the case that both of these parts were true. Establishing a little terminology before we get into the kind of the nuts and bolts of how Darwin's theory is supposed to work. First of all, species. A species is, as I say here, a set of individuals that are capable of interbreeding, such that if they came together and they mated, it's possible, they're genetically compatible in such a way that they're able to produce offspring, and those offspring are in turn able to go on to produce more offspring. If that's the case, then the individuals that we're dealing with were members of the same species. A very closely related term is a population. So a population is a set of individuals, as I say here, that belong to the same species, but live close enough to each other that they're actually capable, physically capable of finding each other and reproducing, of interbreeding with each other. Another term that sometimes gets used for population, more of an informal term, is a gene pool, right? So these are organisms that, of course, they have their genes and they can mix their genes together through interbreeding. So when you look at Darwin's book, which is surprisingly accessible, you don't need to be some kind of an expert biologist in order to be able to understand pretty much everything that Darwin's writing about in his book, because remember, he was writing this for a popular audience. He wasn't writing this necessarily for ultra specialists. But when you look at his book, you see the basic reasoning that he goes through to arrive at his theory. And he starts with this observation that resources in the world are limited. There's not an infinite amount of food. There's not an infinite amount of territory for individuals to live. And so, since populations are always producing new offspring, and they tend to produce more offspring than the environment can support, right? Like I said, the resources are limited. They are not infinite. So this inevitably will lead to a competition for those resources. Some individuals, assuming that there's some diversity within the population, some individuals will just be better able to live in that environment. They'll be better able to access the resources, to use those resources and process them, and to avoid being killed by harsh environmental conditions or by competitors or by predators or whatnot. Some individuals just will be lucky enough to have the right set of characteristics that make them particularly good at being able to survive in the conditions in which they find themselves. And of course, those ones that are better able to survive are more likely to survive, right? And that's really all we mean by natural selection. I'll go into this in a little bit more detail later on. And then the individuals that do survive reproduce, and their offspring resemble, at least roughly, resemble their parents. So they pass on those successful characteristics to the next generation. When you have these three things happening together in a population of organisms, this source of diversity, the natural selection when individuals are trying to survive, some live, some die, and then the hereditary reproduction, and then you sort of start it all over again. After reproduction, you start it all over again in the next generation. If you have these three things in place in a population, then it's inevitable that over time, the species will evolve. Adaptive evolution will occur in this lineage. So let's look at these in a little more detail. The source of diversity. So in any given existing population, there's already going to be some diversity, even if the individuals from our perspective all look very similar. An example I often use is this population of squirrels that live in my area. They all look really similar, but if you captured a huge number of them and started to measure all of their anatomical characteristics, for example, you might find some variation. Some of them have slightly thicker fur, some of them have slightly thinner fur, some of them have slightly longer tails, some of them have slightly shorter tails, and so on. So there's always going to be some variation existing in a population. Then, if it's a sexually reproducing species, then every time two individuals with slightly different genetic composition, but still members of the same species, when they get together to reproduce, they mix and match their genes together in a unique way so that the offspring that they produce are a mixture of the genes of the two parents, of course. So that introduces a little bit more variation in the next generation. In addition, the ultimate source of new genetic variation is mutations, changes in the DNA that happen in the reproductive cells that are used to produce new offspring. So the sperm or the egg, in the case of animals, mutations happen in the DNA of those cells that are used to produce the next generation, so that next generation could have genes that just didn't exist in the previous generation. Over the decades, scientists have discovered some other sources of new variation. For example, when DNA is being copied to produce a new reproductive cell, like a new sperm cell or a new egg cell, it's possible that a gene could end up getting duplicated so that you've got two versions of a single gene. Now, this is particularly interesting because let's say that an individual organism has a gene that produces an extremely important hormone, for example. So here's that one gene, it's producing an important hormone. If a mutation happens to that gene, it might stop producing that hormone and the organism wouldn't be able to survive. But if for some quirk of the DNA replication process, it ended up with two versions of that gene, then one of those genes could mutate and stop producing that important hormone while the other one stays intact and continues producing that hormone. So the individual is able to survive because it still has that important hormone. But that other gene, as it goes through mutations, might produce something else that could be useful to that organism. Now, it might produce a result that has no difference to the organism or could actually be harmful to the organism. But there's a possibility that that other gene could mutate in such a way that it produces some new hormone or some vital new protein that the organism can use to be able to better survive in its environment. So that's why gene duplication, and in fact, whole chromosomic duplication, can be extremely important for introducing dramatic new variations into a population. We've also found really good evidence of what's called gene transfer. So bacteria cells can sort of swap genes, even if they don't belong to the same species of bacteria. They can swap genes with each other. So a lineage of bacterial organisms can suddenly get a new variation introduced by some other species of bacteria. Then, when we are infected with a wide variety of viruses, which is happening all the time, some of the DNA from those viruses could be incorporated into our DNA, or, of course, into any other plant or animal's DNA. They're all being infected by viruses all the time. That viral DNA could get incorporated into their genome and then become part of that lineage. So that's another way of introducing new variations into a population. In any case, the upshot is that a population has to have a source of new variations. It's got its existing variations that it starts with, but it's got to have a source of new variations in order to keep the overall process of adaptive evolution going over the long term, over many generations. So, one important thing to note, an extremely important thing to note about the source of new variation is that it's blind. Sometimes it's referred to as random, and that captures part of it, but random implies that pretty much anything can happen. And that's not quite true for biological organisms. There's a lot of restrictions. The mechanisms of DNA replication and so on are such that they don't allow for anything to happen, but they can have some mistakes or some damage or other kinds of changes introduced into the DNA. But so the overall point is that these mechanisms that allow for new variations to be introduced into an organism's genome, those mechanisms don't know what kinds of genes are good, what kinds of genes are bad, what's going to happen if you change the genes. They don't know what sorts of environmental challenges the organisms are facing, so that the mechanisms can't sort of see that, for example, the environment is getting colder. So we better produce a new mutation that causes thicker fur in this species of squirrel so that they can handle this colder environment. That just doesn't happen, right? It can't sort of look forward and understand what kinds of new variations are needed to keep this lineage going and then produce those specific variations. It just produces whatever, right? Just changes happen. And when you're dealing with an extremely complicated system, like a living organism, and you change something in this way, right? Effectively random, right? That you change it in a way that you don't know what that change is going to do. Chances are that that change is going to be either bad, right? Because the organism is already functioning, right? We've already got a living, like relatively successful lineage of organisms. So if you change something there in the genes, chances are it's going to work worse than it did before. You know, think of this computer that I'm working with right now. Very complicated, very functional. If I go into the hardware of my computer and just sort of randomly tinker with something and change something a little bit, chances are my computer is not going to work as well. Or there's also the possibility that it will have no effect at all. I just changed something that just didn't affect the functioning of the computer. That's also extremely common in biology, that a mutation or other kind of change in the genetic material of an organism just has no effect. It changes a gene, a functional gene, in such a way that it produces the same protein it always has produced. Or it could be a change to a part of the DNA that already doesn't really seem to do anything. So it's just a completely neutral mutation or neutral change in the genetic material. Every once in a while, though, you could introduce a new change that actually helps the organism to survive better than it did before. So going back to my example of the squirrels living in an environment that's getting colder, it could be that some individual is born with the pure luck of getting a mutation that causes its fur to become more thick and more insulative than the fur from the previous generation. So it just happened to get this mutation that just happened to give it an advantage in surviving in an environment that's getting colder over time. So these variations are blind, right? They can't look forward or understand what sorts of mutations are needed, what sorts of new variations are needed to help the individuals survive better in their environment. So most of the mutations are going to be either neutral or bad, but sometimes they actually are advantageous. Then they're born, right? They go out into their environment and they try to just live. So they try to find resources, they try to avoid dangers, they try to deal with the difficult environmental conditions that they're facing, whether it's temperature extremes or problems finding water or whatever it might be. They just go out and they start interacting with their environment. And some individuals will have a set of traits that make them better able to survive in that environment than other members of their species, right? Other members of the species might be able to do okay, but they don't have the set of characteristics that make them able to survive really well compared to the individuals that do have that set of characteristics that really make them able to survive really well. Some individuals might be very unlucky and end up being born with a set of characteristics that make them not be able to survive very well, and they might die relatively quickly. But in any case, since we have this variation in the set of characteristics that the individuals in a population have, we're going to get differential survival, right? Some of the ones that have the set of characteristics that make them better able to survive are more likely to survive. They're not guaranteed to survive because there might be something happens, a predator finds them when they're not paying attention, or they get hit by a bolt of lightning or something like that. So it doesn't guarantee that they're going to survive. It just makes it more likely that they're going to survive. Similarly, the individuals that have a set of characteristics that aren't quite as good at helping them to survive in the environment in which they find themselves doesn't guarantee that they're going to die right away. They might be able to kind of make it through okay, maybe even to the point of being able to reproduce and pass that set of characteristics off to their offspring, which brings us to the hereditary reproduction. So the individuals, this is somewhat obvious, but the individuals that survive longer are more likely to be able to produce offspring. And those offspring at least roughly resemble their parents, given the variations introduced by sexual reproduction and any mutations that might have happened during that process. And then that next generation of individuals, we've got variation there. Some of those individuals are going to be able to survive better than others. The ones more likely to survive are more likely to survive and then leave offspring that have characteristics that resemble themselves. And so we get this process repeating over and over through the generations. So going back to the squirrel example, if it's getting colder in their environment, then the individuals in one generation that just happen to have thicker fur, better insulation, that makes them more likely to survive the intense cold. And they're more likely to then have offspring to whom they pass that thick fur characteristic onto them. And then from that next generation, that by and large overall has thicker fur than the previous generation, because the ones that didn't have thicker fur in that previous generation froze to death before they could produce enough offspring. But from that next generation that does have slightly thicker fur, again, there will be some individuals that have thicker fur than others. And if the environment continues to get colder, then again, the individuals that have thicker fur and better insulation are more likely to survive and reproduce to bring us to the next generation. And the same thing happens again. If the environment continues to get colder, then the individuals with thicker fur will survive and reproduce and so on until finally you get a population of squirrels with very thick fur and very good insulation that are very capable of surviving in this colder environment. All right, so the upshot is that whenever we have a population of organisms that have these three elements in place, a source of new diversity, natural selection of some individuals over others, and hereditary reproduction, and we repeat this over many generations, then we're going to get large-scale adaptive evolution. It's just an inevitability that it's going to happen. Darwin's book was called On the Origin of Species. So far, I've really been talking about this in terms of what's sometimes called microevolution, right? A single species, even more specifically, a single population of a single species is evolving over time in some relatively small way, like the squirrels getting thicker fur. It's still the same species of squirrel, they just have thicker fur. But what we now need to introduce is the explanation for why new species can emerge. How do we get so many different kinds of species? Well, first of all, the theory of evolution by natural selection requires that we already have a population of living organisms that's already, so to speak, up and running and doing its thing in order for the theory to kind of kick in and give us explanations for what's happening. The theory of evolution itself doesn't give us any answers about where life came from to begin with. So that's why I say here, the origin of life is just a separate question, right? That it's a very difficult question. We don't know exactly how life originated on this planet, where it came from or whatever, but as long as we've got populations of living organisms that are up and running, then the theory of evolution kicks in and we can use it to explain what's going on. So where do new species come from? Well, there's two common routes. There's a wide variety of ways that this can happen, but the two most common ones are this. Suppose we've got an existing population that is subjected to a changing environment, like the colder environment that the squirrels were facing. But the environment is changing over the long term. And when I say long term, I mean hundreds or even thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. The environment is changing. New variations are being introduced into this population every generation. And natural selection works upon those new variations that are being introduced. And so each generation resembles the previous generation, but it's a little bit different. You allow this to continue to go on for generations and generations, hundreds or thousands of generations. Then eventually, the individuals that you end up with after thousands of generations of this happening, if somehow you were able to take those individuals in that last population and put them in a time machine or something and bring them back to visit their ancient ancestors from 1,000 generations ago, they might not recognize each other. They're just so different at that point because so much evolution has happened over those generations that they wouldn't even recognize each other as belonging to the same species. And even if they tried to interbreed, it might not be possible. They may not be genetically compatible anymore. If that's the case, then we're dealing with a new species, right? We had an old species, it just evolved for a really long time until finally it just is a different species now. So that's one way. A faster way is when we have an existing population that is split for some reason. Maybe something happens, an earthquake or something happens, and now a river changes its course and it splits the population in two, and the individuals can't cross this river, so they can't interbreed anymore. So now we had a single population that was split into two or more different populations. Then, since they can't interbreed anymore, any variations that are introduced into one population won't also be mixed with the variations that show up in the other population, and they start evolving in different routes. They may even be facing the same environmental conditions, but since different variations are introduced into the two gene pools, they just evolve in different ways. Or it could be that they're now facing somewhat different environmental conditions, different predators, different food sources, different environmental conditions, one way or another. And so even if they get pretty similar variations showing up in each population, which variations are the successful ones is going to be different between the two populations. So again, they start evolving in different directions. One of the really famous examples of this is Darwin's finches, so-called, where on the Galapagos Islands, which are about 900 miles or so off the coast of Ecuador. It's a series of islands, and the islands actually have pretty different environmental conditions, surprisingly different environmental conditions, and different potential food sources on each island. Long, long, long time ago, a population of finches from the mainland of South America, for whatever reason, found itself over by the Galapagos Islands. Maybe there's a giant storm that caused a bunch of them as they were flying around to just get blown way out to sea. And they were flying around desperate and eventually found these islands, and they settled on the islands to see if they could live. But they settled on different islands, and different islands have different environmental conditions. So what counts as a good new variation, right? What counts as a good genetic mutation is going to be different from one island versus another island. Some islands had a lot of insects as a good food source. So individuals that had some new variation introduced into them while they were being produced through hereditary reproduction. Individuals that found themselves with a variation that'll help them to be able to capture and digest insects, they had an advantage over individuals that didn't have that variation. So you let that happen over many, many, many generations, and you end up with a population of birds on an island with insects. That population of birds becomes very good at finding and eating and digesting insects as food. Other islands had fewer insects and more sort of big seeds, very nutritious seeds, but ones that were kind of tough. So you need a big, strong beak to be able to crush them in order to be able to get the nutrients out of them. So individuals that just happen to have the mutations that help them to be able to have bigger, stronger beaks so that they could crush those seeds, they were much more likely to survive than other members of their species that didn't have those variations. So over time, although all of these birds came from a single population that lived on the mainland, as they found themselves isolated on these different islands with different resources and different environmental conditions, then over many generations, they started to diverge. And so now each island has different species of finches. So we had speciation, right? The generation of new species from an older ancestral population. Now we can see how this theory of evolution by natural selection ends up helping us to answer these questions. Remember, the first one was, why is there so much diversity? First of all, just why are there so many different species? Well, there's just been lots of speciation events, lots of times where populations have been split into 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or more different separated populations, and then they evolve sort of separate ways. And that's happened many, 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 many times, millions of times over the millions of years that life has existed on Earth. And so that's why we end up with so many different species. The other question was, why are there so many species that basically do the same thing? So why are there so many different species that all eat bugs or all eat grass or whatever it might be? Well, we have these speciation events, right? So we have this in population splitting and diverging, but they might not become completely different. They might still use the same basic kinds of resources. They have the same basic lifestyles. So they're pretty similar, even though they are technically different species. So if a survival strategy works for one species, it can work for others too, even if they have split apart and started evolving somewhat differently. Why are they so well adapted? Well, that was the whole explanation, right? That's the inevitable result of having those 3 elements in place in a population. Source of new variation, natural selection, hereditary reproduction. When you've got those in place, you will get adaptive evolution by natural selection. So that explains why the individuals that exist in a particular environment just happen to have the characteristics that are necessary for helping them to live in that environment. Because if they didn't have those, they would have died. Another interesting note is that there really isn't any such thing as being perfectly adapted into an environment. There could always be some way that an organism is able to survive even better than it currently does. So really what happens is that species and the individuals that are members of a population are all sort of good enough, right? They are able, they have a set of characteristics that allow them to survive and reproduce, and that's really all that's needed. So they're good enough to be able to survive in that environment. Why does the fossil record have the patterns that it has? Well, one thing is that environments can change so much or change so quickly that a population just can't keep up, right? There's the rate at which new variations are introduced into the population is so slow compared to the rapid rate at which their environment is changing that they just end up not being able to handle those changes and they die. And so a species could go extinct that way. So that explains some of the extinctions that we see. Then also speciation overall explains why we see new species showing up in the fossil record. But then we have that overall pattern of relatively simple to more complex, which leads some people to the assumption that maybe evolution just has this inherent directionality to it, that evolution will always lead to more complexity, inevitably, always more complexity. It's not quite true. Because if we assume a naturalistic origin of life on Earth, then we would assume that those very first organisms will be the simplest possible organisms, right? When we think of before life actually even got started, we just had some kind of complex chemistry going on somewhere on Earth. Uh, and then at some point, that complex chemistry became complex in just the right way and we end up with something that qualifies as being alive. It's extremely likely that whatever that is going to be the simplest possible kind of life. It's not going to go from non-living chemistry to some very complex form of multicellular vertebrates or something like that, from non-life to zebras. That's absurd. It's going to go from non-living chemistry to very basic microorganisms. Then once we've got that, then we've got this population, we've got evolution by natural selection and adaptation and so on that's off and running. And then since anything simpler would just go back to being non-living chemistry, the only direction for new variations, the only direction that we have is towards greater complexity. So it's inevitable that any new variations that end up being successful are likely to be more complex than what came before. That doesn't mean that the less complex life forms somehow don't work anymore. In fact, they might work better. Really, still the dominant form of life on Earth is bacteria. We just don't notice it. But really, most of the life on Earth is microorganisms. So just because it's simpler doesn't mean that it's somehow less evolved or less adapted somehow. So simple life still works very well. It's just that since we started from the simplest possible life, the only direction to go was more complex. And so really, if there's any pattern of this sort in evolution, it's towards greater diversity of different kinds of organisms. And some of them are going to be very complex, and those are the ones that we tend to notice because they're more like us and they're bigger, so we notice them. But really, life evolves in all sorts of different directions, towards more complexity. Then sometimes even when you've got a complex organism, its population over time might evolve if the conditions are just right. It might evolve less complexity and become more simple over time. For example, there are species of fish that evolved eyes, right, so they can see. Having functional eyes is a very complex characteristic. But then if that population of fish finds themselves in a lake that's in a cave so that there's no light, so that there's no point in having functional eyes, we see over time that they might evolve to having the more simple characteristic of having no eyes, no functional eyes. And that's actually been observed. So we can get evolution from relatively simple to more complex, or from more complex to more simple over many, many, many generations. So there's no specific direction towards more complexity or more intelligence or anything like that. The only direction, so to speak, is towards more diversity. I mentioned this one already, that if the environmental conditions change too quickly, then the species might go extinct. A few general points that I'll mention very quickly here is that, and this involves some misconceptions that people might have about evolutionary theory and how biological evolution works. Hopefully this has become clear during my explanation, but adaptive evolution by natural selection happens over many generations. So it happens to a population of organisms. An individual organism can't evolve in the relevant sense. It can't somehow come up with brand new adaptive characteristics that have never been seen in that species before. Or if it does somehow end up showing a new characteristic that's never been seen before in that lineage, and that characteristic somehow gives that individual an advantage, it's extremely unlikely that that individual will be able to pass that characteristic on to the next generation. So the only way that we get sort of progressively more adapted, or just new changes, adaptive changes, to be able to keep up with changing environmental conditions, the only way that can really happen is over many generations. So when we talk about a species evolving, we're talking about the overall species or the overall population evolving over the generations. So it happens to groups, not to individuals. An individual either lives or fails to live. It either reproduces or fails to reproduce. Individuals don't evolve. Small, this is a big point, but I'll do it quick. Lineages end up finding a balance between sort of the resources that they dedicate to keeping themselves alive as an individual. So that kind of natural selection, do they have the characteristics necessary to be able to survive individually? Versus maximizing their ability to pass those characteristics on to the next generation. Some species sort of emphasize individual survival and don't put as much effort into just producing lots and lots of offspring, whereas other species put a whole bunch of energy into producing a giant number of offspring, and then like don't put as much energy into trying to keep them alive. So humans, for example, we put a lot of our energy into keeping our offspring alive. We don't reproduce a ton of individuals, but we do put a lot of effort, a lot of energy and resources into keeping our offspring alive, as opposed to most insects and maybe a lot of fish and some other species like that produce a giant number of individual offspring, but don't put a lot of effort into keeping them alive, and they just kind of let most of them die, honestly. I've mentioned this already, but it's worth re-emphasizing that the process of adaptive evolution by natural selection cannot look forward or anticipate what is needed to keep the lineage running. That there's no mechanism for understanding what kinds of new changes in the genetic material are going to be needed in order to keep these offspring going in the next generation. So it's really kind of it's a blind process. There's no sort of engineering of new traits for the next generation. These are theory virtues. I talked in a separate video about the theory virtues. I won't go into these in this video, but this theory of adaptive evolution by natural selection has these theory virtues, certainly has them more dramatically than alternative theories for life. In fact, there's not really any good major rival to evolutionary theory at this point in biology and the life sciences, because the current version of evolutionary theory has these theory virtues very dramatically. And with that, I will go ahead and stop. Thank you.